I've always been the cautious type when it comes to road trips. I make sure my tank is full, my phone is charged, and I avoid driving late at night unless absolutely necessary. But sometimes life throws you into situations you can't avoid. A few months ago, I had to drive across 3 states for a family emergency. It was late October, the nights were growing colder, and I was running behind schedule. By the time I left the hospital, it was past 10 p.m. My plan was to drive straight through, with no stops, if I could help it. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The highway was nearly empty, the occasional car speeding by in the opposite direction. I had my music on low and a coffee cup in the cup holder, trying to keep my focus on the road. But then, somewhere around midnight, I saw her. At first, I thought I was imagining things. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, just outside the reach of my headlights. As I got closer, I realized she wasn't moving, just standing there, her arm outstretched, thumb pointing toward the sky. A hitchhiker. I don't know why I slowed down. I never pick up hitchhikers. It's practically rule number 1 of solo road trips. Don't stop for anyone. But something about her made me pause. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s, dressed in a thin hoodie and jeans. Her hair was dark, hanging in damp strands around her face. But it was her eyes that caught me. Even from the car, I could see they were wide and frantic, like she was terrified of something. I pulled over, rolling down the passenger side window just enough to talk. "You okay?" I asked. She leaned down, her face partially obscured by the shadows. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "I need a ride, just to the next town." I hesitated. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive away, but there was something desperate in her voice, something that made it impossible to say no. "All right," I said finally. "Hop in." She climbed in, clutching a small backpack to her chest. As soon as she shut the door, I noticed how cold the air had become, like she'd brought the chill from outside with her. "Thanks," she muttered, staring straight ahead. "No problem," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where are you headed?" She didn't answer right away. Her hands were trembling, and she kept glancing at the side view mirror like she was expecting to see something or someone following us. "Just keep driving," she said finally. "Please." The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. For the first few miles we drove in silence. I tried to make small talk, asking where she was from, but she only gave short, vague answers. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and she never took her eyes off the road ahead. After about 20 minutes, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "So, what were you doing out there?" I asked. She stiffened, her grip on the backpack tightening. "I got lost," she said quickly. "Lost?" I glanced at her. "Out here? There's nothing for miles." She didn't respond. That's when I noticed her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the dim light, and her eyes were fixed on something behind us. I followed her gaze, but the road was empty, just darkness stretching out behind the car. "Is someone following you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She flinched, shaking her head. "Just keep driving," she whispered. The tension in the car was unbearable. I tried to focus on the road, but my hands were slick on the steering wheel. Every so often, I caught her glancing at the mirrors, her breathing shallow and rapid. And then, just as we rounded a curve, she grabbed my arm. "Stop the car," she said, her voice trembling. "What? Why?" "Just stop." Her panic was contagious. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as we came to a sudden halt. She was out of the car before I could say anything, her bare feet crunching on the gravel shoulder. "What are you doing?" I shouted, stepping out into the cold night air. But she didn't answer. She was staring down the road, her face pale and terrified. I followed her gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, there was a figure far down the road, just barely visible in the weak moonlight, was the outline of a person. They were standing perfectly still, facing us. "Do you see him?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. "He's been following me," she said, her voice barely audible. Before I could respond, the figure moved. It didn't walk, it glided, closing the distance between us faster than should have been possible. One moment, it was far down the road, and the next, it was only a few yards away. The headlights illuminated it briefly, and I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its face stretched and featureless, like a blank canvas. It tilted its head, as if studying us, and then its mouth, if you could call it that, opened wide. The sound that came out wasn't a scream. It was a low, guttural growl, vibrating through the air like the hum of a far-off engine. "Get in the car," I shouted, grabbing her arm. We scrambled back inside, slamming the doors just as the thing reached us. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the gravel, before finding traction. The car shot forward, and in the rearview mirror, I saw it chasing us. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, and impossibly fast. No matter how much I accelerated, it kept pace, its blank face staring directly at me through the mirror. "Don't look at it," she screamed, covering her eyes. But I couldn't help it. Its gaze was hypnotic, drawing me in. My vision blurred, the edges of my consciousness fading, as if I were being pulled out of my own body. And then she grabbed the wheel. The car swerved violently, snapping me out of whatever trance I was in. The thing in the mirror was gone, replaced by the empty road. We drove in silence for the next hour, neither of us daring to speak. When we finally reached the outskirts of the next town, she asked me to pull over. "This is far enough," she said, her voice hollow. Before I could protest, she was out of the car, disappearing into the night, without so much as a thank you. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. When I finally worked up the courage to look in the rearview mirror, my heart stopped. In the back seat, written in fog on the glass, were two words: "Still here."